When we talk about Filipino swords and Filipino blade craft, especially within the historical martial perspective, there are several blades that stand out that are really indicative of the kind of style and the kind of designs that are truly made for the Filipino warrior. Number one, in my book, when I say Filipino martial blades, we are talking about the Filipino balisong. Whenever we think of Filipino blades, it is the balisong that comes to mind. Another blade that comes to mind, especially to Filipinos, when we think about Filipino blades, we think about the Mindanao kris. But one type of Filipino knife, or depending on the size, a Filipino sword, comes to mind when we think about its use in the theaters of war that the Philippines was involved in, specifically the Filipino-American War and in World War II. And the same exact sword comes to mind when we think of, quite possibly, the most powerfully designed Filipino sword ever made. We are talking about the Filipino Barong. This particular blade shape is so synonymous with warfare that there are endless documents, books, and articles written about its use in the theaters of war that the Philippines was involved in, but also its use among practitioners, specifically Antonio Illustrisimo. This specific barong was gifted to me by my good friend Ryan Burkhart at RNJ. He got it in, of all places, a vintage store in Tennessee. A few things I want to point out about this specific barong is that you can see how well loved and well used it is based off of all of the vintage patina that happens to be on it. Regardless of how it's been used or even how old it is still very sharp to the touch. So either it's been recently sharpened or honed or even possibly reprofiled. But I will say that the feel in the hand of this barong, and I wanted, before purchasing a barong, I wanted to make sure that I got something that was used, authentic, but most of all, you can feel that power in the barong. So I got lucky when my good friend Ryan messaged me in December and said, "Hey, Merry Christmas, I got this for you." So Ryan, thank you very much for this wonderful gift. I promise you, I have been researching this, working with this for quite a while, and so now, lo and behold, the video is here. My own personal understanding of the Filipino barong is on one part research, on the other part anecdotal. The first time I heard about the barong sword actually started with a story that was related to me by my father when we were talking about Filipino history as it relates to its military engagements. And one thing I want to point out here is that the Barong Tagalog, which happens to be the formal wear of all Filipino men, nationally speaking, so the word barong is in front of that term. So Tagalog is considered the main language of the Philippines, but the word barong happens to be in front of it. So the term is popularly known as Barong Tagalog, and the word barong tends to be associated with this shirt, and it's made in such a way so that it is somewhat translucent and you have to wear a t-shirt underneath it so that the entire wear of the shirt, which is worn in really the most formal settings, is such so that you wear an undershirt underneath it and then the barong. My father, when we were talking about the Barong Tagalog and how it even came about, had a military context. Apparently, the Barong Tagalog was not necessarily the uniform of formal wear in the Philippines. This was something that was imposed by the colonial Spaniards. Why is that? Because what was happening in the Philippines when it was colonized by the Spaniards was that Filipinos would sneak up on Spaniards and they would have underneath their shirts a barong. Now, this is more along, from what I understand, it has more of that Visayan profile, meaning it's just a little bigger so that it is very hard to hide underneath the shirt. It is much longer than my entire torso as it goes across it. But there are smaller versions of this, and according to my father, those smaller versions of the barong were being kept underneath by revolutionary Filipinos who were rebelling against the colonial Spaniards, and they would just talk to the Spaniards, have a normal conversation with them, reach under their shirt, they would just go ahead and decapitate them. This became so prevalent, according to my father, with regards to the use of the barong, in that it was being hidden underneath the shirt, that the Spaniards made it so that the national wear of Filipino men had to be translucent. So this is why the Filipino Barong Tagalog is made of the kind of material and constructed in that way. So this was the first time I started to hear about the barong and the barong sword. I wanted to share this story with you because it informs us a little bit about what its historical context of it is, but also its connotation relating to its power. The barong, from what I understand, is far more prevalent in the south of the Philippines, specifically the Tausug tribe. Now, the Tausugs, interestingly, were the tribe that adopted Antonio Illustrisimo when he ran away from home. So there are pictures of him in his traditional Tausug garb, and in some of those photos, he is wearing a much smaller version of the barong. In fact, that barong sword is what is famously associated with Tatang Illustrisimo because it is associated with his first use of it. In that, when he was 16 years old, there's a story, he ended up using a barong sword on a much older man who, according to the stories, he had ordered an alcoholic drink at a tender age of 16. One of the elder Tausugs spoke to him and said, "Hey, you're not supposed to do that, you're too young." Apparently, there were words exchanged, the barongs were drawn, and eventually only one man was standing, and that was Tatang Antonio Illustrisimo. Such was the power of the barong sword. It is said that he was able to cut down that individual with one stroke. The main points that I want to get across to you, my audience, as it relates to the Filipino barong is, unlike the Filipino balisong, which in many ways can be viewed as a type of daily carry and a daily wear and has been associated with all types of violent crime, it also has been Americanized, and this here is the Benchmade 85, so that made with better materials, it is something that's a little more accessible and in many ways removes a lot of that stigma. In fact, there are many swords and blades in the Philippines that have a lot of utilitarian connotations, so that when you think of them, like the itak, there are associations with it relating to the field. Even the ginunting has connotations to military use, but also the field. The barong, even though it has seen field use, remains enigmatic in the entire collection of Filipino blades because it has retained its reputation as a powerful tool of war and has the capability to cut down a person with one stroke. One of the things that always stands out to anyone who is considering a barong is the handle. Now, there are all types of barongs in the market, but this one is a little more traditional. There are several reasons as to why this one is a little more traditional. One of them is this kind of hook handle that you can see here. So there are some more ornate handles where it really depicts the shape of the Filipino seahorse, which you can kind of see here, but there are versions of this that are far more ornate. However, there is a functional reason for it. As you can see, when I put my hand through the handle, my fingers all the way up to my ring finger can actually rest into the handle. So now when I put myself in this position with the tip up, now all of a sudden when I start to do these powerful slashes, this hook here works so that it secures my hand into the handle as I launch that slash. So as the momentum of the sword is such so that tip speed is increasing as it starts to move forward, the counter movement to that is that my grip actually becomes more locked in and secured the more powerful the stroke happens to be. This is a very important feature if you happen to be looking for a Filipino Barong. You want it so that when you grip it, it has this nice secure hook. And I'm very thankful to Ryan for finding this traditional Filipino Barong so that when I put my hand in, I am really locked and loaded here. So when I start to use this barong, it is ready to go. The other feature that I want us to be mindful of is that it does not have a guard. And this is something that tells me as a practitioner that the barong is not really optimized for thrusting, because you need a guard for thrusting in case you have something slipping, meaning your hand slips forward. But because the handle is designed so that the hook is down here, and every time I swing, it actually locks my hand into position, this is more of a power slasher, cutter. So now we move on to the leaf profile design that is a signature of the Filipino Barong. Notice that the belly swell actually starts right about a third of the way through, swells all the way through to the second third, and then starts to taper towards the tip. We can see that also, and it's hard to tell in this camera, but you can start to see a little bit of that also when you're looking at the spine of the barong. It starts to thicken right around the middle of the spine. What that tells me is that this is designed so that there's enough heft and power that supports the tip of it, but the tip is light enough so that that tip speed, because it's lighter, starts to develop momentum, but it is completely supported by the mass of the blade, which happens to be along the center. In my opinion, that type of design is what makes it exceedingly powerful when it comes to cutting and slashing. When we compare this to a Japanese katana, as powerful as this Japanese sword is, specifically this design, the Hanwei Elite is a very powerful tool which is designed specifically for tameshigiri. Notice that there is a graceful curve of the sword without any sudden swells anywhere along the blade. It is relatively uniform. It gets its power primarily because of its two-handed application and the ability for the swordsman to initiate their core and fire from their hara so that the entire torso actually initiates a slash and powers right through the target. The leaf spring design of the barong, what we see is the opposite. Rather than seeing that curve in the Japanese sword, where it would curve and you would see what is called the sori, S-O-R-I, instead you get the opposite. You see this expansion of the mass of the blade away from the edge. So now you have far more mass. What this does is that because of that excessive mass, the practitioner derives a lot of that power from the design and the mass of the barong itself, so that I don't need a two-handed application for this. This allows the sword itself and its mass and its design allows it so that one cut using arm-centric movements only allows the sword to cut right through its intended target. This, in my opinion, is what earned the barong its rightful status as the most powerful sword in the catalog of Filipino warrior swords. One of the things that stands out to me is that as an edged weapon, it stands out in terms of its ability to flow from long range to mid range and all the way into short range. Because it has this beautiful spine that has all of this mass supporting the blade, by the time I get into close range and I put my own physical mass behind it, this is a far more deadly tool, especially because it allows me to either press on with the angle that initiated the entry with, or redirect it so that if I had to come up, I have the complete support of my entire torso and even my appendicular anatomy, my arm. This is what makes, to me, the barong perhaps the most powerful and most versatile martial tool in the entire Filipino martial catalog. I'm going to be moving a little bit with the barong. This is something I want you to keep in mind as I move with the barong. Number one, its power, which I cannot put on full display in my household, but also number two, how it flows seamlessly from one range to another without having me switch grips or even change my overall biomechanics. So I really hope you enjoy this video, and thank you for letting me share.
The minute I put my hands on the Filipino Barong, I immediately feel how heavy it is. This is very different from the other Filipino swords that I have handled. The heaviest that I have handled has been the Bicolano Minas Bod, but this somehow feels twice as heavy as that. So it's going to demand a lot of my skill and seamlessly integrate it with my strength and athleticism. A lot of that is going to come down to what happens when the tip of the sword falls forward and the blade becomes parallel to the ground. Right about here, I can feel all of that strain on my wrist and my shoulder, so I know what I have to do to make it work, and it helps me to understand the unique demands of the barong. It does not behave like all the other Filipino swords that I have handled. First thing I have to consider is what to do with my live checking hand, which is on the left side. Do I put it in the same shoulder height, or do I do the Dizon method where I put it where it is lower than shoulder height? In this instance, I'm going to opt for the Antonio Illustrisimo method where it's on the same line as the shoulder, because when I slash down angle number one, my left hand is out of the way. If somehow my left hand is in the way, I risk injuring myself. So I'm going to opt for the Antonio Illustrisimo method where the right hand shoots out, circles in, and the same exact thing happens with the left hand. It goes out and it comes in. So it's almost like this wax on, wax off movement. It's very circular, not linear in the slightest. So you're going to see a very different angle when I do this over here with an angle number one. Notice how my left hand comes out and then comes back in. Same exact thing with the barong. This is the only way I can really start to handle it and feel it with control. But my gosh, can I feel this in my forearms? It's really starting to burn, and this is something that is really challenging my skill because of the heft and weight of the barong. So I have to make some really subtle adjustments in my core and in my grip. So the first thing I'm going to adjust is making sure that when I really pull this in after an angle that goes out, I have to pull it in with my core, so that when it goes back out, I have to really rotate my hips in, and I can now start to do one of two power assists. One of them is with the left hand, where I go ahead and push forward with it. This actually helps relieve the stress on my right forearm because of the weight of the barong. But the second one is a fulcrum assist with my right shoulder. This is a very deceptive angle to attack with, because once I rotate that hip and I allow the weight of the barong to fall, the blade naturally aligns with my right shoulder, which allows me to close the distance and then go right back out. This is a very natural technique for the barong, either for the right shoulder, but I can also do it with the left shoulder. Notice that I can now facilitate all types of close quarter techniques with the specific intent of using it in close quarters melee combat. So the mass of the barong is going to play a crucial part in this, in that once I use the mass of my body to get behind the mass of the barong, it generates a kind of momentum that actually builds on itself, especially when I am looking at other opponents that are next to me. So when I finish with this guy, I go ahead and take a look at the other guy. So I have one here, another here, so that when I go in, start long range, go in, that cut goes all the way through to the second guy, then possibly a third guy on this side. The beauty of the barong and its mass is that it is building on a kind of momentum that is built on my movement, but also the weight of the barong. With all of this in mind, the last thing I want you to think is that the barong is a kind of dueling sword. It is in fact the furthest thing from it. This is designed for open warfare. You're surrounded by enemies and you wade into the battlefield and you build that momentum off of the very powerful barong based on its design. The best way to take advantage of it is that handle, because it all but locks your hand in, and once that hand of yours is locked into that handle, you can now rotate freely off of your core and you can swing and fire off of the shoulder using all of that fulcrum power assist. And when you have that and you're surrounded by all of the enemies that you have on the battlefield, that barong is going to be your best friend, because it is going to be deriving a lot of its power from your momentum and your footwork. This is a very different kind of Filipino sword because it relies so much on power and speed. Thank you for letting me share the first episode of the Estocado Barong project. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.